In 1955, director Elia Kazan and star James Dean gave the world a dark family drama set in the shadows of the Santa Lucia Mountains.
In 2021, we try a whiskey from the shadow of the Rocky Mountains.
The film is East of Eden.
The whiskey is Tin Cup American Whiskey.
And we'll review them both. This is
the Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And this week we are looking at the 1955 film East of Eden.
Where's Aaron?
I don't know. It's not my brother's keeper.
Where did you go?
For a ride.
What did you quarrel about?
You?
You're angry about the money.
No, I'm not angry. I like it. I think it's great. I'm going to go away. I'm going to take that money with me, and I think I'll start me a little business. Just like my mother did.
What do you know about your mother?
I know where she is, know what she is, and I know why she left you. Couldn't stand it. You didn't really love her any more than you do me. Because your goodness, your rightness, you never gave either one of us an inch, ever, for what you thought was right. You kept on forgiving us. You never really loved us. I know why you didn't love me. Because I'm like my mother, and you never forgave yourself for having loved her.
Brad, if there's one thing I've learned about you over the course of our friendship, it's that East of Eden is one of your favorite books. You have mentioned it time and time again on this podcast. And, you know, when I put together the list of movies that I thought we should watch, I did throw in James Dean films. He only made 3 of them before he tragically died in a car crash, and his very first film was East of Eden. And it's probably his least known among the 3 films that he made. And yet, at the time it came out, this movie was a huge deal. Elia Kazan took this job after just coming off On the Waterfront, which has become one of the most iconic American films of all time. He's riding high on the success of that, and they bring in this stage actor, just like in the vein of Marlon Brando, named James Dean, to make his film debut in this gigantic adaptation of a John Steinbeck novel. And so, Brad, I thought that this would be a really interesting thing to put on the podcast. I'm sure that very few people listening have probably seen this film, and yet I think it's really worth talking about for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that it lines right up with one of your favorite novels of all time.
Well, it's interesting that you use the word giant when describing the adaptation, because I felt like the better word to use would be truncated.
Oh,
like
for
this, sure. Like this barely captures maybe a quarter of the book.
Right.
And so, and granted that, you know, this is Steinbeck just waxing poetically about the Salinas Valley and California and the problems of good and evil and all sorts of things. So it's a long, long book. But the film adaptation is pretty short when you consider the original work that it's based off of.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really good point for us to talk about, Brad. So when Kazan started to adapt this novel, he looked at the structure of the book, and essentially the book is like a modern-day retelling of the story of Adam and Eve and their 2 children, Cain and Abel. And the book, as I understand it, the Steinbeck novel, is basically divided into like 4 parts, 4 books. And the movie really only focuses on the events of the last portion of that book, part 4. And Kazan really was worried that Steinbeck was not going to go for this, but he knew that it was just too huge of an undertaking to try to adapt the entire novel. He saw part 4 as the climax of the whole story, and the one that would really emotionally resonate the most, as it dealt with, a character representing basically Cain trying to please his father in Adam. And that's where he saw like the crux of all the material. And so they decided to just hone in on this one part of the novel. I don't know, Brad, like you've read the book. I have not. Do you think that it was a wise decision to not try to tackle the whole thing? Do you think that it was successful in just adapting one part of the novel?
I think that if you were going to adapt this novel, it's not like Lord of the Rings, Bob. Like, not every moment of the book is going to be key information that you have to have put into the movie, right? But I do feel like there's a level of nuance that you get by telling the entire story that you miss out on a little bit in the movie. But all that being said, I think that if you were going to take any part of the book and turn it into a movie, this would be the most important part. And overall, I was decently impressed with the way they could take this massive novel and boil down the core elements of the entire book into a movie that really captured only a quarter of the book's content. I overall was pretty impressed with what Kazan did here.
I think that's a really good starting point for us, Brad. And, I try to do my research before we come into our episodes on both our whiskeys and our movies. And I've seen this movie a few times. I really enjoyed it. For a long time, I would have said this was my favorite James Dean film. I don't know if I'm quite there after this watch through. But I came into this episode...
But it's definitely in your top 3, right?
Definitely in my top 3. But I came into this episode, wanting to kind of round out some of my research on the movie. And so right after we went into quarantine, I picked up a copy of East of Eden, knowing that we were going to be, coming to this episode at the end of the season. So I bought the book, Brad. And I'm like, I have nothing going on. Who knows how long we're going to be in lockdown? I have plenty of time to read this book. And Brad, I made it to page 4. And I'll tell you what, man, those 4 pages were just chock full of some of the best geographical information about the Salinas Valley that one could ever ask for. But yeah, I have absolutely no knowledge of the book coming in, other than that it's like, it's a loose adaptation of the story of Adam and Eve.
Have you ever read the Space Trilogy by C.S. Lewis? I
have not. That's the Paralandra and all that?
Yeah. There's, in the first one of that series, C.S. Lewis does his best Steinbeck impression because he goes into detail about the terrain of this planet, and it just goes on and on for page after page. And I'm just like, look, guys, I love a flowery description just as much as anybody else, but you don't got to talk about the geography for just, like you said, Bob, you're on like page 4 or 5, 6, and you haven't even talked about a single human being yet. Humanity is an abstract compared to the importance of the geography.
Well, and the thing about Steinbeck, too, is he's proven that he can do it in short volumes. Like, Of Mice and Men is one of my favorite books of all time, and it's 100 pages long. He did it with The Pearl. He clearly knows how to write in a concise and succinct way. And then he gets to, like, The Grapes of Wrath and East of Eden, and he's just like, no, I'm going to write about a turtle laying in the middle of the road for a whole chapter. And everyone's going to lap that stuff up.
Yep.
So, Brad, maybe thankfully, we don't have all that excess stuff in this movie. We're just focusing on the last part of this novel. And I think for anyone who hasn't read the book or hasn't seen this movie, Brad Explains is going to be pretty essential for this episode. This is the part of the show where Brad breaks down the plot of the movie that he has just seen, often for the first time. Brad, I know how much you love the book, but let's just try to focus on what we see on screen here. And if you could fill in our listeners on the plot of the movie East of Eden.
Yeah, Bob, I would love to. East of Eden is about 2 young boys named Cal and either Aaron or Aaron. The actors kind of go back and forth on what they call him.
It's like Han Solo.
Yeah, it's Han. Come on, Han. So it's about these 2 brothers, Cal and Aaron, who are essentially representations of good and evil, or Cain and Abel. And as you start the film, you see Cal searching the town of Monterey for information about this woman. And you find out later on that it's his mother, that he's searching for his mother, who he thought was dead, who actually runs a brothel, essentially. And he feels like he is the embodiment of her evilness, that she, represents evil, and his father, Adam, represents good. He's a Bible thumping, but even beyond that, he's not like legalistic to the nth degree. He's very loving, kind, just a good man. And Cal just feels like he is nothing like him, and he literally just got all of his morality from his mother. Whereas Aaron seems to be perfectly good and doesn't do anything wrong. And the story kind of follows a few different points. His father, Adam, is trying to basically invent refrigeration so that they can send lettuce across the country. It fails spectacularly. They lose all their money. And after losing all this money, Cal hatches this plot to try and make all this money back for his father as like a gift. And essentially, he's trying to earn his father's love. And so he invests in beans because World War I is about to happen. And nobody's sure if they're going to go into the war or not, but he bets that they are. And because they are, the price of beans is going to skyrocket. And so they basically buy some futures on beans and sell them for a massive profit so that he can make back the money that his father lost. Meanwhile, Aaron is dating this girl named Abra, and Abra slowly turns from hating Cal and being fearful and mistrustful of him to becoming, his closest confidant. And they discuss life, and they really just eventually fall in love with one another as Aaron becomes colder, more bitter, more up in an ivory tower, if you will, casting stones at the world around him. And Abra realizes that Cal is down to earth and understandable and willing to accept her just as she is, that she doesn't have to be something else for him. And so at the end of the film, Cal gives his father this money. Aaron gives his father the gift of proposing to Abra, who isn't really pumped about it. And his father rejects the gift of the money and tells him to get him a gift like what Aaron got him. And so in a fit of rage, Cal takes Aaron to meet his mother, who Aaron had thought was dead. And with this, it throws Aaron off the deep end because he had always immortalized his mother as this perfect angelic figure. And realizing that she runs a brothel sends him off the deep end. He gets drunk, enlists in the army when he had proclaimed to be a pacifist. And it sends his father into such a shock that he has a stroke. And the movie ends with Aaron going off to war and Cal staying home and taking care of his father. And his father finally shows him the sort of love that he always really deserved.
Yeah, Brad, thank you for that. That was a fantastic breakdown of the movie. I'm kind of curious about where we should start with breaking down this movie. And I think that, just for giving some background to the film, I think we should kind of talk about James Dean, not just his performance, but kind of what he represented in Hollywood at this time. So in the New York scene, this idea of method acting had really taken hold. And one of the central locations for this was this place called the Actors Studio, which you might know from watching that TV show Inside the Actors Studio. And in Hollywood, there were at this time like two really big method actors that had come over from New York and really caused a stir. And that would be Montgomery Clift and Marlon Brando, who had made a huge splash in Streetcar Named Desire and just won the Oscar for On the Waterfront. And so there was this huge demand to start getting, some slightly younger actors from New York into Hollywood because they could see that people were eating up this new revolutionary style of acting. And so James Dean came over from New York. He was very quickly signed to 3 movies in rapid succession. He beat out Paul Newman for this role, but obviously Paul Newman went on to have a very successful career, but he came from the Actors Studio as well. And Brad, when I look at James Dean, or when I watch him in these 3 movies, it's really hard to judge his performances because, he died tragically and he had skyrocketed to like teen heartthrob kind of levels overnight. And this was the only movie that James Dean got to see completed before he died. So 2 movies that he made came out after he died, Rebel Without a Cause and Giant. And by the time we get to Rebel Without a Cause, he had become such like an immortalized figure in the eyes of young people that he was kind of like impervious to criticism. Like you could say that he wasn't very good in a movie, but you'd just be kind of being a dick at that point because he was dead. Do you know what I mean? I think everybody just kind of like backed off of James Dean at that point. But with 60 something years between the time that he died and now, I think it's probably okay for us to talk about his performances in the movies that he was in. And I got to be honest, Brad, I think that he was probably the least polished of all of those actors that came over from New York. And Elia Kazan talked about it a lot too. He just basically like left a camera on James Dean and let him do whatever he was doing because he said he was like psychotic when he was acting. He was like a madman. He'd hunch over, he mumbled, you couldn't understand what he was doing. And a lot of critics didn't like this about James Dean. They thought that he was just basically doing a bad Marlon Brando impression. And to be honest, Brad, I kind of think that I can see what they're talking about. Like James Dean's really good But I think that had he had the opportunity to make more than 3 movies, we would have seen him kind of figure out a little better how to internalize some of those things that he always had to externalize. And when I compare him to somebody like a Marlon Brando in On the Waterfront, I just really don't think there is much of a comparison there. He's really good, but there's still something lacking here for me, where it just seems like he hasn't quite figured out how to not be huge and showy all the time.
Yeah, the Marlon Brando comparison is perfect because there's multiple times throughout this movie where he would just make certain mannerisms or the way he said certain things that I don't know. It's like, Bob, I'm sure at some point you've said something and been like, oh my gosh, I just sounded exactly like my dad. Right?
Sure. Yeah.
Like I have that all the time. And it almost feels like James Dean is Marlon Brando's son. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like he just does so many things and he looks a decent amount younger than Brando that it feels like he's just the mini me.
Mm-hmm.
And like the spot that really drew it out for me was when him and Aaron got in that fist fight. And he the only time of the movie he actually raised his voice a little bit, he exploded with energy. And the way he yelled, it just sounded exactly like Marlon.
Yeah.
I don't know if you picked up on that, but I had to rewind it and watch that part again because I was like, what just happened?
Well, I think one of the things that I don't want to totally say that his performance is bad or anything like that. I don't think it is. I think he's really good. I think part of the reason that it's hard to evaluate too is it seems like the direction that they were given, all the characters, is, hey, you guys are teenagers. But the way that was interpreted by all the actors and maybe the director was like, so because you're teenagers, you can't act like teenagers. You have to act like children. And I think that the way even Julie Harris, even the guy that plays Aaron, they all kind of act more like they're 12 than that they're 18. I don't know if you kind of caught on to that, but it just seemed like they were really externalizing their childlike nature in this movie. And it kind of threw me for a loop because these are all actors who are clearly in their 20s. And they seem like they're trying to play a 10-year-old boy and girl.
Yeah, Abra, by far, I feel was the worst at this. She consistently just kind of came across as this flouncy 12-year-old, like you said. And I wanted her to grow up more earlier in the movie. I think later in the movie, especially in the final scene with the nurse, you see her on a level that you didn't see her before.
Mm-hmm.
But I really wanted them to not be so young throughout the movie.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, you can really see it in James Dean's performance as well. And I think there's moments for him too. There's this one part, and I can't remember exactly what Aaron's talking about, but it's or what Adam is talking about, but I think it's right at the part where he brings in the coal chute and they're figuring out how to make things go faster. And there's just this shot of Adam talking to somebody, and James Dean is there in the background, biting his thumb and smiling because he wants to please his father so bad. And it's man, you look like a 4-year-old kid. And I think that's the thing that, I understand that his whole character is, I want my father to love me. But I think there's ways to show that to the audience without it being the biggest, most obvious thing that you're externalizing. It kind of seems like he hadn't figured out how to act for a camera as opposed to acting for a crowd of people in a theater in New York yet. Because it seems like he's playing to the cheap seats in some of these scenes.
You'll have to give it back.
Who? I can't give it.
To the people you got it from.
No, British purchasing agency, I can't give it back to them.
Then give it to the farmers you robbed.
We didn't rob anybody. We paid 2 cents a pound, 2 cents over the market for that stuff.
Cal, I sign my name, and boys go out, and some die. And some live helpless without arms and legs. Not one will come back untorn. Do you think I could take a profit from that? I don't want the money, Cal. I couldn't take it. I thank you for the thought, but
I'll keep it for you. I'll wrap it up and we'll just keep it in here. And then
I'll never take it.
Yeah, and I think the other problem there is that the adaptation focuses solely on, James Dean wanting his father to love him. And I think that misses one of the main points of the book, which isn't just Cal wondering whether or not his father loves him. Cal continually is wondering, do I even have the capability to be good? And I think they touch on that throughout the movie, but it's really lost in the shuffle with this search for money and love and him falling in love with Abra. And I think it kind of misses the core of what Steinbeck was pushing for, which is, can somebody who appears to be innately evil achieve anything good in this world? And that, that was something I kept looking for, and you see hints of it, but it's hidden. It's hidden so far deep in this movie that I just wish that they had drawn that out with Cal much more deeply. And I think that you miss out on Aaron as well. Aaron in the book is much more well fleshed out and developed. And in the movie, I don't know about you, Bob, but Aaron just felt very flat and one-sided, and like, yes, he's kind of happy at the start of the movie and sad at the end. Because he is such a flat character, I just don't know if he's a good enough foil for Cal to push him to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, and Brad, this is actually something I wanted to ask you about just really briefly, because you had a really extended like monologue you did in, I think it was our Tree of Life episode. And you talked about how the crux of the book East of Eden was this Hebrew word. What was the word again?
Timshel.
Timshel, which essentially translated to what? Was it like goodness, or what did it?
Essentially, the word Timshel can be translated in a few different ways, but they're talking about the problem of sin in our life and whether or not humans can rule over sin. And with the finality of the book's interpretation, they basically say that the word should be interpreted as thou mayest, that every human has the opportunity to rule over sin, that we have a choice in the matter, and that it isn't predetermined, but that we have the opportunity to choose the good in our life over the evil. And that's like so important when it comes to understanding this book, and I would hope this movie.
Well, yeah, and Adam has this kind of little exchange with Cal early in the movie where he talks about, like, that's what makes a man, the opportunity to choose not to do evil, but to do good instead. But when I watch this movie, Brad, it doesn't seem to me, and this is as a guy who hasn't read East of Eden, but it doesn't seem to me that it captures the spirit of the book the way that you've talked about it with me so often. You know, Kazan basically said at one point that he was attracted to this book, you know, because it essentially has sympathy for the devil, right? Like it makes Cain into a sympathetic figure, and it does so to such an extent that it makes Adam and Eve and Abel all look like they're the terrible people, right? Especially Abel in this movie, the character Aaron. He's like such a goody two-shoes that we're supposed to hate him. At the end of the movie, he runs off in a sort of selfish display, and we're left with Cain repenting for what he did. But Kazan said that he really wanted to make a movie where he could kind of display people like Adam, these Bible thumpers and devout religious people, in a negative light because he disliked them. And I think, to me, Brad, you can kind of see that in this movie, that the message is a little bit muddied, and I couldn't quite understand like what the overarching message was. And I know that at the very, very end, James Dean calls back to that early scene where he talks about a man has to decide whether he's going to do good or do evil. And you do get to see the kind of redemption of the Cain character, Cal. But I really was struggling to try to figure out, like, what is the overarching point of this movie? Because in the end, like, Cain still, the Cain character still does like wreak havoc and destruction. Like, he essentially does kill his brother. He sends him off to war, and he makes his father have a stroke. And then at the end, he's just like, you know, I did a really terrible thing and I'm sorry. And then it's like, all right, well, everything's forgiven now. And I don't know, man. Like, I guess maybe I'm just so used to the biblical story, but I'm still just like, where's the comeuppance? Where is any real consequence to his actions? And while I appreciate the message of repentance and forgiveness, it seems like it's plopped into this movie that is kind of completely trying to preach a different thing, which is like devout religious people are hypocrites and our hero is the weak, wounded, flawed person. And then at the end of the movie, once he's like brought into the inner circle of the religious person, it's like, all right, well, everything's good now. So I couldn't quite tell, like, what were they actually trying to say with this movie? And I guess I'm asking you, Brad, like, could you see what they were trying to go for? Was it the same as how it was in the book, or was it kind of muddied to you as well?
It was very muddied to me, Bob. I think this is the problem with adapting massive novels that have hundreds and hundreds of pages to explain their subject into a 2-hour film. There's just a certain level of complexity that you can never engage in a movie. Now, in a movie, you can do amazing things, from the original Star Wars movies to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Like, there are just visual feats that you cannot accomplish in a book, that brings to life this imagination. And movies are great for that. But when it comes to these philosophical treatises like East of Eden, I just struggle with thinking that a movie could ever capture the core of the message because of what you just said. You only have so much time to bring about this message. And so in the end, you're going to end up with characters who are flat. You are going to end up with jumps in logic where, like you said, like all of a sudden, well, we're just okay with Cal now. Just, I don't want this other nurse. I want you to take care of me. And so with these jumps that are made, I think that there's so much nuance in the book that is filled out with other characters like Samuel Hamilton and Lee. And you get a lot more in-depth on Kathy Ames, his mother, that you just miss out on the movie. And so you're just left kind of going, oh, well, that was a nice story. Like, he was bad, but then his dad still loved him. And that's cool.
Well, I'm glad we're kind of on the same page there, Brad. And I have a lot more thoughts on this movie, but we are running a little bit long. And so I think maybe it's time for us to hit pause and try this Tin Cup whiskey. What do you say?
Let's get to it.
All right, today we are checking out Tin Cup American Whiskey. Now, you might have seen this one on the shelf at your local liquor store. It has a really interesting bottle design. And Brad, we're working off of a sample bottle here, so forgive me if I use the wrong shape, but it's either like a hexagonal or an octagonal bottle. It has this really cool multiple-sided thing going on, and it comes with a little tin shot glass on top. So, it's kind of gimmicky, but it's really fun to look at. And it's a really affordable whiskey as well. I will say that it is called Tin Cup American Whiskey. It's not called Tin Cup Bourbon. And the reason for that is because the company that makes this, they source their whiskey from MGP. And, we've talked about MGP a lot. They're a huge producer of spirits in Indiana. So distilleries that don't produce their own stuff, they just buy pre-made whiskey and bottle it. So what they do is they buy their bourbon from MGP. They take it over to Colorado. They cut it with, they call it Rocky Mountain spring water. I have no idea. I can't verify that. So they cut it with water, and then they also add a little bit of another product that this company makes called Stranahan's, which is an American malt whiskey. So they just add like a hint of malt whiskey into this. It still technically qualifies as a bourbon. So the mash bill on this is about 64% corn, 32 rye, 4% barley. So it's a high rye mash bill that does qualify as bourbon, but they don't market it as a bourbon. So Brad, as we get into this, I'm kind of excited to try it because I've seen it a ton of times. The sample that we're drinking today was provided by our good friend Jen Lowers. This thing is only 84 proof. So I think we should kind of temper our expectations a little bit in terms of what we're going to get on the nose, taste, finish, because it is such a low proof whiskey. But Brad, as I've been talking, I'm sure you've been nosing it. So what are you picking up on the nose?
Bob, do you remember when we reviewed just plain old Black Label Jack Daniels?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's cut from the same cloth. It's a similar lighter color. It's got a little bit of a banana-y nose to it. It's very light on the nose. You really have to like get your nose in there in order to get that aroma.
Yeah.
But for me, there's a little bit of banana, a little bit of citrusy notes. I don't know if it's like a lime or an orange or something in there. But honestly, I'm having a pretty hard time pulling any notes from this. But in general, it's kind of light, airy, sweet, nice nose that I'm not like unimpressed by, but it's not blown me away. I'll give it a 6.5 out of 10.
Yeah, Brad, for me, it's actually like those more grain elements that are coming forward. Like it has that kind of really pleasant corn sweetness to it. Maybe a little bit of baking spice, but I'm really getting the rye and I'm getting the barley more than I thought I would. Like this is, I'm getting whiffs of like a blended scotch in this. And so when you first said, hey, do you remember when we drank Black Label? I thought you were going to say Johnny Walker, because to me, like I'm picking up elements of some of those more cheaply made blended scotches in this. So I'm not getting the banana, which I would really, really like to kind of balance this all out. For me, it's more of the rye and the barley that are coming through. And I'm kind of with you, Brad. Like it's not an unpleasant nose, but I really have to take a strong whiff of this to get anything. So I'll also give it a 6 out of 10.
Bob, this is going to sound bad, but I hope that it comes across more neutral than I think it will. If you just put a label under this that said generic American whiskey, I would go, yeah, it's generic American whiskey. There's nothing bad about it, but there's nothing that like stands out to me either. You get a little bit more sweetness on it than I think I got on the nose. There's a little bit of spice from the rye. You know, it is a higher rye whiskey. And like you said, I think the grains are really starting to come through for me. That malted barley kind of comes in hard on the palate. And it doesn't necessarily leave a memorable taste, but it's not bad in any way either. I think in the end, I'm going to give it a 6 on the palate for the flavor. Like, it's fine. It's generic. It's good. I'd drink it.
Yeah, Brad. So for me, again, it's the rye spice and it's the barley that are really coming through here, which is really funny to me because that still only constitutes, according to what I've seen online, like 35-36% of the mash bill. And yet it's like really dominantly a more kind of bitter grain going on in here for me. I don't get a lot of sweetness on this. And then after I swallow, the note that's left on my palate on the finish is almost like a mineral water kind of flavor. Like it's very mouthwatering, but it has some kind of mineral thing going on. I don't know that I love this, Brad, because it doesn't have the bourbon characteristics that it needs to have to complement the rye and the barley. So I'm also only going to give this, you know what, I'll give it a 5.5 on the taste.
Yeah, like I said, Bob, it's generic American whiskey, not American bourbon. and it's just missing out on a little bit of something to make me give it a higher score. And when I get to the finish, once again, I don't mean this in a bad way, but it's just more of the same. There's a little bit of crispness to the finish, the spice from the rye and that little bit of the smoothness of the malted barley kind of hits you. But overall, it's kind of grainy. It's a little bit spicy. It's fine. I'll stick it a 6.
I think for me, this almost reminds me of like a lesser quality Irish whiskey. Like it has the grain forwardness of an Irish whiskey. And obviously it's not a single malt Irish whiskey. This would be, like some sort of blended grain, but like it has the characteristics of like the lightness of an Irish whiskey, that little bit of malt that you get in an Irish whiskey, not a ton of sweetness, but it just doesn't do it quite as well. And I think maybe it's has something to do with the dilution going on here. I'm not entirely sure what they could do, Brad, to kind of round out this flavor profile. But on the balance, I guess I'm only going to give it about a 5 on the balance. It's not bad. It just is very clearly missing something in the flavor profile that would tie it all together.
Yeah, I'm right there with you on the balance. It's not a super well-balanced whiskey in the fact that there's nothing that pops out at you and grabs your attention and makes you want to drink this whiskey. And so I'll just stick with you, Bob. 5 out of 10.
It's just hitting me now, Brad. I did not give it a finish score. But again, I talked about this kind of mineral water thing. The finish is not very long lasting. Honestly, like you forget that you took a sip of it almost immediately after taking a sip of it. I'm only going to give it a 4 on the finish. And Brad, that's going to bring us to the value on this. In the state of Ohio, a fifth of Tin Cup American whiskey is going to cost you $27. So, Brad, this is right in line with something like a Jack Daniels, which I think is right about at this price point, maybe actually a few dollars less. I think this is way overpriced for what you're getting, Brad. And especially like they're a non-distilling producer, an NDP, which means they're importing or they're sourcing their whiskey. I understand that they're adding a little bit of their own malt product to it, but like it doesn't seem craft enough to really be a craft whiskey. It doesn't seem mass produced enough to merit a $28 or $27 price tag. I think I'm only going to give this about a 4 on the value, Brad.
Yeah, I'm actually going to give it a 3.5. Like $27, you can get Jack Daniels for $24, and that is a vastly superior buy, in my opinion. If I was pricing this whiskey, I'd probably put it at about $17 to $19 for a fifth. The quality just isn't quite there, and once again, it feels like we have a packaging that is more important than the actual contents within.
Yeah, Brad, I'm coming out to a 24.5 out of 50 on this product, if I'm calculating correctly. What are you coming out to?
I'm coming out to a 27 out of 50.
Wow, that's actually higher than I thought it would be, Brad. So you are over the halfway point on a whiskey. I am under our halfway point on a whiskey. Generally, though, I would say that when I look at our whiskey scores, it's not really until something hits about the 35 out of 50 mark that we like wholeheartedly give a recommendation. This is well below that. We're coming out to a 51.5 out of 100. Or a 25.75 out of 50. I would not recommend this whiskey, either for trying or for buying. Brad, would you?
Yeah, I wouldn't. If you see the packaging and you really want to try it, go buy a 50 ml for like $1 or $2. If you want to try it out. But overall, it's just not worth recommending. But Bob, I do have a question for you. You said that you weren't sure if you were tabulating your results properly. Are you like pen and paper, like with your pencil erasing mistakes, adding up the score?
No,
or are you using a calculator?
I'm using
like
my
the rest
calculator
of us?
on my desktop here, but But
you're not sure if it's right.
No, I have this terrible habit of like always trying to declutter, so I X'd out of it halfway through, and I had to try to remember what my scores were. So I have no idea if this is accurate. But
so you were relying on the old noggin.
Yeah, which is very unreliable.
Okay, I get it now.
Well, Brad, those are our supposed final scores for Tin Cup, but what do you say we get back into talking about East of Eden?
Let's get to it.
All right, that was Tin Cup American Whiskey, a whiskey that neither of us recommends. And Brad, I'm still trying to feel out whether we both would recommend this movie East of Eden. But before we get around to our final scores, I do want to touch on the rest of the cast surrounding James Dean. And Brad, I'll let you go ahead and start us off. Who would you like to point out first for their performance?
Well, we talked about her already a little bit, but I'm curious to hear what you have to say about Julie Harris as Abra in this movie, because I kind of went back and forth on her. I think overall I really liked her performance, but there was a few rough spots as well for me.
Yeah, Julie Harris, this was also her first film, I think. She would go on to a pretty successful career. She was in some great movies. She was a theater actress as well. I think she's really good in this movie, Brad. And I think that, like you, I kind of had to play that dance of, is she not good? Is the part not written very well? Is she being given bad direction? And I think a lot of it is this weird sort of sense that I got that all of the young actors were being instructed to kind of play younger than they were. And so they all kind of come out acting a little kiddish. And so because it's not unique to her, I think that tipped me off that, like, okay, it's not just that she's doing a bad job with this performance. I think she was just given some kind of wonky direction here and there. But overall, I think she does a pretty good job. Like, she really doesn't have a ton to work with. She's the supportive girlfriend of Aaron, and then she's the supportive girlfriend of Cal. And her entire character arc is just making that switch from loving Aaron to loving Cal. And for someone who, like, that's their only character beat, she does a really good job with it. And I really loved that scene of her and James Dean out in the field where they're talking about, you know, how she grew up feeling like she wasn't loved as well. I thought that their chemistry was really great. I thought that the little kind of improvisational things they do with their hands where she's putting the flour on his face and stuff, I thought that was all really brilliant. So I liked her a lot in this movie. And I think that my quibbles with it are more her character and maybe the direction she was given.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with you there, Bob. What's another character that you enjoyed in this film?
Well, you know, I really wanted to talk about the character of Adam, played by Raymond Massey. This is a guy who had been in Hollywood for decades and did not get along at all with James Dean, really hated this whole new method style of acting. And because James Dean was such a method actor, he intentionally provoked Raymond Massey off camera because he was staying in character. And so by the time they were filming some of their more confrontational scenes, Raymond Massey just truly hated this guy. Elia Kazan also grew to dislike Raymond Massey because he felt that he was too, like, high and mighty, like, I am a classic Hollywood actor, who are all you people? He went on to say that he thought Raymond Massey was basically only a one-note kind of actor and that he regretted hiring him. I actually would take the opposite stance in that he doesn't show a ton of range here, but that's the whole point of the character of Adam. Like, Adam is he knows what he believes in. He's very staunch in his, you know, devoutness, and he doesn't like Cal. And I think that that kind of cold demeanor really, really plays well with this, you know, this young James Dean who's just bouncing off the walls. I really liked Raymond Massey in this movie.
I really liked him a lot as well. I thought his performance really grounded the entire movie, that he is the foundation from which all of the other characters move towards and away from throughout the entire movie. And so I thought his performance really helped the movie find its feet, especially when you have an actor in James Dean who, like you said earlier, he seems so caught up in the shrugging of his shoulders and how he, like, cocks his head at a funny angle or jumps on a swing and swings at his dad. He feels very untethered from reality, and Adam as a character and Massey as an actor really just bring a foundational element to the movie that is pretty desperately needed.
Yeah. So, Brad, I do have one more person that I'd really like to talk about, and that would be Jo Van Fleet as Cal and Aaron's mom, Kate. I think she's the best performance in the whole movie. I think she steals every scene she's in. She also came from the theater. This was her first movie. And believe it or not, Brad, she was only 38 years old when she played this character. They made her up to look much older. I think that she embodies the sort of world weariness of this disillusioned, jaded, cynical character of Kate. And it was also her line deliveries. They were so naturalistic. It seemed like she was reacting to what James Dean was doing more than acting and reciting lines. And I thought that she was just by far the performance that hit me emotionally the most and also just wowed me with her abilities. She was fantastic. She won an Oscar for this movie as well.
I will say that, and this is just purely me based on my imagination of the book, I imagined somebody, because even in her older years, they talk about how beautiful she still was. I imagined somebody who looked a little bit better than her. Not going to lie. That kind of threw me off for a second, where I was like, oh, she is not very attractive at all.
Well, and again, that's like an intentional decision too. Like,
yes,
they clearly made her
was.
up to be, yeah.
Yeah, it definitely was. And so I think that was kind of a misstep on the costuming or, you know, makeup department, whatever you want to say. I think that was a bit of a misstep, because she is supposed to be this transcendent beauty that age, you know, does touch by the end of the book, but she's still just utterly beautiful. And I kind of struggled with that. But once again, that was more of my understanding of the book. And I will agree with you that every scene in which she interacts with Cal, whether it's the start of the movie when she's, you know, yelling for her henchmen to get him thrown out, to the place where they're actually just walking along the road talking calmly to one another. She is stunningly good in this movie.
The whole sequence where they're negotiating the $5,000 loan I think is maybe my favorite scene in the whole movie. And it's not, obviously, like, it's not the biggest stakes or anything like that, but it's written really, really well. And they weave in and out of kind of talking about their personal lives, and then they come back to business again. And then somebody angers somebody, and then they come back to talking about business again. And the way that it's written and the way that those two actors play off of each other, I really thought that was like a tour de force in the middle of the movie, in a sequence where you wouldn't think to find the best acting in the whole film. I found it there.
Well, and I wanted to point out two more people in this movie. I really loved the sheriff, played by Burl Ives.
Oh.
But I also really liked Mr. Albrecht in this movie. I thought both of their performances, they're tertiary, they're third-level characters that don't affect the plot a ton. But I thought that their performances were heartfelt, genuine, and caring, and I believed them with every inch of my soul.
Oh, absolutely. Burl Ives is fantastic. And I think that, like, most of us know him for being the Holly Jolly Christmas guy. He's a fantastic actor, and he liked to take roles in movies like this that were a little more controversial, a little darker. He ends up winning an Oscar later in the decade. Brad, at some point, we're going to watch his performance in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, which is one of my all-time favorite, stage to film adaptations. Burl Ives is just phenomenal, and I think that more people need to realize how good of an actor he was, and he shows it here in what's basically a thankless role.
And Bob, can we talk about the cinematography for a second? Because for the most part, this movie is a pretty standard, shot, reverse shot type of, there's not a lot going on, but then you randomly get these really forced perspective angles of Cal and his dad. And you get a weird, like, loopy camera when he's on the swing and he's, like, swinging at his dad. Did that throw you off at all? What did you think about the cinematography that, Kazan and his director of photography used?
So, Brad, I'm glad you pointed this out, because this is, widescreen was just becoming huge in Hollywood at this point, and they were filming in this aspect ratio called CinemaScope, which was a really, really wide screen compared to what you would see even a year earlier in Kazan's On the Waterfront, which was more of your kind of standard letterbox shape. And I think that they were experimenting, and Kazan has gone on record saying, like, this was trial and error in a lot of ways. They basically had informed him that you can't shoot from closer than 6 feet away. Like, whatever your subject is needs to be at least 6 feet away from the camera. He's like, are you kidding me? Like, how are we ever going to get close-ups? And so when they do have close-ups, there's like slight distortion on the edges of the image, because that's just the aspect ratio they were shooting in, and they hadn't figured out how to get around that yet. But Kazan basically said, I tried to use that for the best effect that I could. Now, when it comes to the stuff you're talking about, which we like to call Dutch angles, which is where you really tilt the camera for like extreme effect, I thought that it was used fairly well. Like the early scene where Adam is having Cal read out of the Bible, like all the images are kind of cocked to one side, and it's so that Adam is higher up in the image and Cal is lower in the image. It's this power dynamic, and you see it represented visually. And so, like the scene where Cal's swinging at Adam, it's like every time he comes close, they tilt it so that Cal is in control and in power, and every time he goes farther away, they tilt it back. It does get a little distracting after a while for me, because you're not used to seeing a camera rock back and forth like that. But I at least understood what they were trying to do. I don't know if it was super successful, but you're right. It's worth pointing out what they were doing with the kind of power dynamics visually in the movie.
It felt to me like one of those early movies that, like you said, they were trying to figure out what they could do with a camera. And on certain spots, it might have worked well. And other spots, it distracted from the movie itself. So I like overall, I'm okay with them pushing the limits of what cameras can do and figuring it out. But it's, it doesn't always hit on all cylinders.
Brad, can I also just say, like, as the guy who's a movie nerd and who has been going on this journey with you for the past almost 2 years, I'm just so proud that you, like, of your own volition, brought up the cinematography of a movie to talk about. That you would not have done this at the beginning of this podcast, my friend.
Yeah, well, hey, you learn a little bit as you go on a journey with Bob freaking Book.
That's right. And Brad, I think we have learned about all we're going to learn with this movie. So I think it's time for us to give our final scores. You know, I thought that this was my favorite James Dean movie for a long time. I certainly still think it's a better movie than Rebel Without a Cause, which is just like hammy and over the top. I don't think I would put this over Giant at this point. Giant, I think, might be his best film. I'm kind of coming out, Brad, to like a 7 out of 10 here. I liked it, but there were also just long stretches of scenes where it just seemed like they could be tightened up, where they were like in love with following James Dean around and letting him take long pauses between each line and do whatever he wanted to do improvisationally. I really feel like this movie could have been 10, 15 minutes shorter if they tightened up some of those things. And so because of that, like, it's fine. It's good. I enjoyed it. But to some extent, I think that we only really remember this movie because it was an Elia Kazan movie and because it has this tragic figure of James Dean attached to it. And if it wasn't for those two things, I don't really know if we'd even be talking about this movie today. So for me, it's a 7 out of 10.
Yeah, Bob, I think this movie struggles because it's trying to get so much into the movie, so many different parts of the book, and yet it is only a movie. It can only contain so much of literature. And so, like, you have things like they talk about her hands a few times and the importance of her hands and how clean her hands are, and they have close-up shots of her hands, and it feels unnecessary when placed in a film. Whereas in the book, you understand the importance of it because they're able to really delve into what it means to her. And so you get all of these ancillary little things that kind of drag on the movie. And like you said, it just could have been a lot tighter. They could have moved this story along at a faster pace. It could have been 1 hour and 40 minutes. And so overall, I liked this movie a lot. It just had a decent amount of struggles for me. I'm at a 7.5 out of 10, Bob.
All right, so that's bringing us to an average of a 7.25 out of 10. We're a little bit lower than what the general public thinks about this movie. It has a 7.9 on IMDb, so we're a little bit cooler on this, Brad. But for Film and Whiskey Nation, we'd like to know what you think of this film. Have you watched East of Eden?
I was like, Bob, nobody's seen this movie. Our listenership is just going to drop for this
just
movie.
Dramatically.
And I don't care. That's fine.
I was gonna say, I did this for you, man. Don't worry.
But if you've actually seen this movie, if you have any desire to see this movie, let us know. You can find us on, Facebook, Instagram, all the socials at Film Whiskey.
Next week, we're going to be looking at a movie that a lot more of you have seen. Director Denis Villeneuve's 2015 effort, Sicario. So join us for that next week. For the Film and Whiskey Podcast, I'm Bob Book.
I've never seen Sicario.
And we'll see you next time.